Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is the Ukraine war update concerning the peace negotiations. I'm doing these daily videos because so much is happening. It's very dynamic. The negotiations between, well, predominantly the US and Russia, and then on the side, maybe Ukraine have a little bit of an involvement about their own future and existence. But anyway, yeah, we're going to get into some more details concerning that. Please, if you haven't already done so, watch my video that I did last night. It's quite a dense informational video on Steve Witkoff and a very central part that he is playing, aligned with the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, being a real estate mogul who has had involvement with the Russian mafia and Russian money over decades. He is, and he also has a Russian, he's descendant from, I think it's paternal grandparents on the Russian side, the Soviet Union, Belarus, Belarusians, I think, but Soviet Union anyway. Steve Witkoff is very much more to blame and very much an integral part in where Ukraine is being pressured at the moment by actually the Americans as much as the Russians. Anyway, check that out. It's a super important video. Now, before we go into this video fully, it would be great if you could like, subscribe, and share. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, that'd be super, super cool. And thanks so much to those who have already done so. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, who has said, don't make premature conclusions about the conflict in Ukraine being close to an end. So he's warning that the war isn't actually close to an end, putting a bit of a dampener on things and telling you really what the Russians think. Actually, it could be interpreted that he's blaming allies of Ukraine for any peace deal that isn't made because, you know, obviously the Russians want a maximalist set of objectives attained. So he says in various countries, including the US, there will be many people trying to disrupt the peace process. Well, we're going to go on to one of the main, the disruptor in chief, Donald Trump here, unfortunately deferring back to a previously held position, which is nothing short of egregious in my opinion. Listen to him here.
I think so, yes. What kinds of concessions are the Russians going to have to make?
So he's been asked, if you couldn't hear, what kind of concessions are the Russians going to have to make? The Russians are going to have to make these concessions. So you're not talking about, well, maybe over here they need to do that. It's the size of their army over here, blah, 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 blah. No, these are the concessions.
Well, they're making concessions. Their big concession is they stop fighting and they don't take any more land.
So he says they're making concessions. They're not, by the way. They stop fighting. So their concession is to stop fighting. So if you are a thief that's stolen loads of stuff of all the people in your local area, he's gone and mugged and burgled houses, and he has all this stash, he's just about to burgle some more, and then he gets caught by the police, and the police say, right, this needs to stop. And they say, do you know what? I'm going to make a concession. I won't do it anymore. I'm going to stop doing any more burgling and thievery and mugging. And the police go, brilliant. That's fine then. Okay, see you later. Bye. How about all the stuff he's already nicked? Doesn't that need to go back to the person he's nicked it from? No, he's made a concession. The concession he's made is he's not going to keep doing the thievery. Okay. And that's where Donald Trump is. But then it's this last point that really gets my goat. He says the concession Russia are making is that they're not going to take any more land. It's this idea that he said before, that he said that one of their concessions is they're not going to take all of Ukraine. Russia can't take all of Ukraine. Yeah, Russia might well take more land, but at what incredible cost to the Russians? And so this kind of approach to concessions, I think, is very, very dangerous for Ukraine. And it just shows that Donald Trump is just firmly on the side of the Russians here. It leaves a really bad taste in my mouth, I have to say. Now, there is essentially, the way I read the American approach to the war in Ukraine is total chaos. You got Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner going off and doing things in secret, and go and watch that video I did last night with about Steve Witkoff doing things that the State Department, that Marco Rubio doesn't know about. He finds out about later. It's complete chaos. And now you've got people like Don Bacon and Brian Fitzpatrick, both Republicans, coming out and saying Steve Witkoff should be sacked, that he's a traitor, essentially. I mean, there's my read on the American Trump administration's approach to the war is it's complete chaos, pretty much like all of their policies at the moment, and certainly foreign diplomacy. It's just chaos. They don't really know what they're doing, and you've got all these different actors with different agendas trying to do things. And I think you've got, like I've said previously, you've got two major worldviews. You've got the Marco Rubio, probably Pentagon, Department of Defense, like core people that have been there for some time. You've got their ideas of how the world works, and the idea there is that Russia are the bad guys, obviously the bad guys. And then you've got the Project 2025 worldview, which is J.D. Vance, is Stephen Miller, Russ Vought, Heritage Foundation, and Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff. These guys are isolationists, pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine. You got add to that Trump hates Zelensky because Zelensky stopped him being able to bribe Zelensky over weapons and dirt on the Biden family, and that led to Trump's impeachment. So he hates Zelensky over that. So you've got these two worldviews fighting, and occasionally Marco Rubio stamps his authority on the situation, saying, no, actually this, but then really it just oscillates very quickly back to the isolationist wing having dominance, and it is just chaos. Now, Representative Mike Quigley here gets it right. He's questioned whether U.S. security guarantees under Trump can be trusted, especially by European allies. Quote, why would anyone believe a president who let Putin blow through 6 deadlines? He makes promises and nothing happens, just like the Tomahawks. It all changes month to month. It's that chaos. It's just always changing. There's no consistency. There's no reliability from the Trump administration. And I think you have these different worldviews operating. You've got also the dynamics within certain domains. Like there are these theories at the moment that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is going to be ousted and replaced by Dan Driscoll, who is the Army Secretary, has been sent to Kiev, but he's a close friend of J.D. Vance. I went to college together. It looks like he's on the same page as that kind of wing. And just goodness knows what's going to develop over the next week or the next 24 hours even. U.S. Army Secretary was warned Ukraine of imminent defeat while pushing the initial peace plan, according to NBC News. So this is the report that Dan Driscoll, a guy that's associated with all those other people, the more isolationist wing, has apparently, according to NBC News, pushed the initial peace plan, a 28-point pro-Russian peace plan, saying that, hey, you guys are just about to get defeated. You know, you've got to take this or you're done for. Marco Rubio has replied, saying this story is just the latest example of long-running series of 100% fake news reports claiming a rift inside the Trump administration over how to end the war in Ukraine. These people don't just get things wrong, they literally make things up. You could argue that the lady doth protest too much here, that actually that's exactly what is going on, that there is a rift in the Trump administration, and Rubio's on one side, and actually, I'm not even sure that Pete Hegseth, when he was a Fox News anchor, was very much advocating being really strong on Russia. And he's coming and he's having to toe the party line and do all these kind of culture war things that, yeah, he's big on that. But actually, I think he's not really very involved in the peace negotiation at all, is he? This is really being left to people like Steve Witkoff. And then Marco Rubio finds out about it after the fact. So anyway, like I said, in my video last night, there was this whole process of the development of the 28-point peace plan that either was actually given to Witkoff and Jared Kushner by Kirill Dmitriev straight up, or actually the latest is that these guys developed it and then brought Kirill Dmitriev in to give extra points to the plan. Either way, it's like, even if Dmitriev wasn't involved right at the beginning, it just shows how pro-Russian Witkoff is, because he's started developing this plan that was fully aligned to the Russian objectives. Anton Gerashenko says of this article that was in, I don't know, is this the Bloomberg one? Yeah, Bloomberg article. Witkoff advised Russia on how to pitch Ukraine plan to Trump. So Witkoff got Putin through Ushakov to phone Trump the day before Zelensky arrived to hopefully receive Tomahawks, and that scuppered the Tomahawk deal. That was Witkoff's doing. Okay, it's very possible. So Anton Gerashenko says, and this is basically in response to my video last night, as in this topic, what we're talking about here is a kind of carry on from that video last night. Gerashenko's asking, you know, what happened there with the Tomahawk conversation, who leaked these phone calls. So in case you didn't watch the video or haven't read about it, there are 2 leaked phone calls from that Bloomberg News have released. One is between Steve Witkoff and Yuri Ushakov, and one is between Yuri Ushakov and Kirill Dmitriev. Where did these phone calls come from? As in, who leaked them? Who recorded them? Who leaked them? Gerashenko said it's very possible that the conversation between Steve Witkoff and Putin's aide Ushakov has been leaked by the Russians themselves. It's obvious that they make recordings of all conversations. Why would they do it? One, to stop the negotiations from happening. So although this doesn't paint maybe doesn't paint the Russians in a bad light, it paints the Russians in exactly like we'd expect them to have, you know, in terms of these conversations, but actually it paints the Americans in a bad light and it adds to the absolute chaos, and therefore is more likely to stop a peace deal from taking place, these leaks. And so it could be a very clever leak by the Russians. It could too compromise the US side, President Trump personally, and destabilize the political field in the US, which it certainly seems to be doing. 3, it brings on arguments between the US, Ukraine, and Europe. That certainly happened with regard to the negotiations yesterday, and it creates informational chaos. 100%. Putin doesn't want negotiations because he doesn't want to declare this up front. So he needs a global scandal in the USA. Such activity from Putin clearly shows that the other sides are close to a deal and forcing Putin to peace. Putin also realizes that in case he refuses the sanctions will be enhanced, and a full dependence of Russia from China on China will follow. Interesting thesis there on those phone call leaks. And we'll look actually a little bit at the phone call leaks in a second. Just there are plenty of articles written on, you know, Steve Witkoff being pretty much compromised, not so much as an agent, but just existing in that world. This is Craig Unger, who's written a couple of books on similar topics, but who, what, why, a piece there on Putin's point man, what's behind Steve Witkoff's ties to the Russian mafia. And so, you know, you can go and read up on this elsewhere. Okay, Steve Witkoff helped Russia derail Ukraine's access to Tomahawk missiles, says Snell reports. He tipped off the Kremlin about Zelensky's US visit, giving Moscow time to arrange a call that convinced Trump to block the deal. Witkoff actively works against Ukraine's defense in coordination with Putin's regime. So the White House defends Witkoff after the leak of a conversation with Russian officials. So there's going to be a lot of fighting fire today as a result of that Bloomberg News piece of the leaked phone calls. Quite an incredible piece, as well as the Wall Street Journal article that I referred to at the beginning of last night's video. Yeah, there will be a lot of news, I assume, on that today. Now, this is, I didn't include this. I didn't talk about this in the video last night, but this is so revealing. This is part of the transcript from one of the telephone calls, the one between Steve Witkoff and Yuri Ushakov, one of the big negotiators there. So American foreign policy is now Putin's bitch, says Jay in Kiev. Look at how Putin's guy pats Witkoff on the head like a good little boy. Good boy. So the phone rings. Steve Witkoff. Hi, Yuri. Yuri Ushakov. Hi, Steve. Hi, how are you? Steve Witkoff. Good, Yuri. How are you doing? Yuri Ushakov. I'm okay. Congratulations, my friend. Steve. Thank you. Yuri. You made a great job. Just a great job. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Steve. Thank you, Yuri. And thanks for your support. I know your country supported it, and I thank you. It's just this, like, almost vomit-inducing relationship between the two, where Steve Witkoff, you know, remember he said to Tucker Carlson that he doesn't see Putin as a bad guy. This is a megalomaniacal genocidal dictator. Of course he's a bad guy. Tendar then responds to Don Bacon here, saying US Republican Congressman Don Bacon calls for the firing of Witkoff due to his apparent pro-Russian stance, which is perfectly evident in those articles that I've mentioned. So Don Bacon said last night, for those who oppose the Russian invasion and want to see Ukraine prevail as a sovereign and democratic country, it is clear that Witkoff fully favors the Russians. He cannot be trusted to lead these negotiations. Would a Russian paid agent do less than he? He should be fired. You have a Republican calling for the firing of the envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff. And here he is speaking to Caitlin Collins from CNN, saying if he were a paid Russian agent, would he be doing anything differently? He must be removed. Oh, that's Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick has also added. These secret sideshows need to end. Let Secretary Rubio handle this with fairness and objectivity. So actually, let's go to what Brian Fitzpatrick, another Republican, said. This is a major problem, and one of the many reasons why these ridiculous sideshows and secret meetings need to stop. It's just the absolute joke of this negotiating process where you've got different people doing different things unbeknownst to, say, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. You've got Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner going off and having secret meetings with Kirill Dmitriev. Dmitriev's in Miami for 3 days. They're drafting up this plan together. It looks like a complete Russian plan. Most of it seems to have been written in Russian, then translated in by Google. But, even if that's the case, maybe with some of those points, a lot of them were actually arguably developed by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner first. It just shows that these guys are completely compromised. And there's probably, if Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, who's following Trump around the world diplomatically, and doing all these trade deals. You see what's going on in Serbia, you see what's happened in the Middle East after Trump went to the Middle East. These guys are grifting. Anyway, Brian Fitzpatrick says, allow Secretary of State Marco Rubio to do his job in a fair and objective manner. In other words, the people who are working at the moment, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, these are not people doing the job in a fair and objective manner. I mean, this is a stinging rebuke of the present negotiating process. Absolutely incredible. And then we've got Ted Lieu here. Actual traitor, says this senator. Steve Witkoff is supposed to work for the United States, not Russia. So you're having people come out now and call Steve Witkoff an actual traitor. So that's US. Oh, he's representative. He's not a senator. Sorry, he's in the lower house. Has called Steve Witkoff an actual traitor following revelations of his backchannel dealings with Russian officials during Ukraine peace negotiations. This should be honestly so controversial in the American media spaces. I don't know whether it will be. I mean, we've got so normalized to Trump's way of doing things, but his way of doing things is to cozy up to the Russians. Now, Putin's negotiations leader Dmitriev responded to the Bloomberg leaks with a series of posts accusing warmongers and war profiteers of trying to sabotage the US-led peace effort. He claims media attacks are driven by those who benefit from continued conflict, but insists peace will prevail. Of course, he doesn't care one iota about peace. He just wants Russia's maximalist objectives to be attained. And I think this whole chaos, as mentioned by Gerashchenko, will help that to come about, because there will be no peace negotiations. Russia can continue doing what it's doing, believing that it will have some great military success, which I'm not at all sure will happen. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, the other guy here in these discussions, reacted to the leaked calls with US envoy Witkoff, saying someone is leaking or eavesdropping. And accusing opponents of trying to sabotage US-Russia contacts. He confirmed Witkoff is expected to visit Moscow next week as part of ongoing peace negotiations. So, of course, Witkoff spends more time in Russia than he does in Ukraine. Of course, that's how it works. Absolutely outrageous. Now, John Ridge here from Tochny, or associated with Tochny, military missile expert, says, in response to Christopher Miller from Financial Times, US holds secret Russia-Ukraine peace talks in Abu Dhabi. So this is what happened when then we heard that. So this is subsequent to the 28-point peace plan that was developed over a month. Then they met secretly in Abu Dhabi, the Americans with the Russians, but we also hear that Kirill Budanov was there. U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll is in the United Arab Emirates for talks with Ukraine's military intelligence chief Kirill Budanov and a Russian delegation as Washington pushes a peace deal to end Kremlin's war. So interesting that that's Dan Driscoll. So John Ridge says, by far the most dangerous development in the past months is J.D. Vance and his acolytes, including Driscoll, displacing other factions in the administration for eminence in foreign policy. This is almost like the central thing that's going on here. Like everything else, the chaos and the different viewpoints and Secretary of State not knowing what's going on and all of this insanity can be, I think, sourced from this move in the White House that's been happening actually throughout the entire administration as they purge more and more established either politicians or civil servants, lawyers, JAGs, four-star generals, all of these people getting purged, Doge coming in, getting rid of left, right, and center, all these people. And then they're replacing them with isolationist Project 2025 people. This is, by the way, what Project 2025 envisaged. This was exactly what they said. What was it? Was it Article E or Article F or whatever in that, which is, or yeah, where they were essentially going to purge and replace all these kind of establishment people with Project 2025 acolytes and cult followers, if you like. Well, John Ridge is onto it. Like the most dangerous development is the JD Vance and his acolytes, like Dan Driscoll, replacing these other people, moving them aside so that there is prominence in foreign policy of this isolationist America First agenda that is super dangerous for the rest of the world and is actually not good news for America going forward. He says they are ideologues who would undo the work of 80 years of American policy. And I absolutely agree with that. That's what's going on here. Now, Lindsey Graham has come out and said he believes that there will be no peace in Ukraine as long as Putin thinks he is in control of the situation. So Lindsey Graham, the senator, said, I hope, a Republican senator, I hope the meetings in Geneva will bear fruit and that Ukraine and the United States can agree a way forward to end the horrible war. I appreciate President Trump and his team for trying to push for peace. However, it is clear to me that there will be no peace for as long as Putin believes he is in the driver's seat. He will insist on capitulation, not peace. To grant this would encourage more aggression throughout the world, and it would come back to haunt us all. It's absolutely true, by the way. In that regard, America and the rest of the world have many cards that have yet to be played against Putin's Russia. I hope we can find an honorable and just peace soon. But if Putin continues to reject ceasefires, compromise peace proposals, and insist on capitulation, then it is time for the United States and the rest of the world to start playing their cards differently. Yes, except that needs to happen now, like right now. Just, assume that Putin will demand capitulation. He's not interested in peace, and just absolutely hammer them with sanctions to the hilt. Like, take your sanctions bill that you've been trying to get enacted, the Blumenthal Graham's sanctions bill, and go to town on it. Let's start forcing Trump's hand. You are an advocate for Ukraine, Lindsey Graham. Let's turn that into tangible outcomes. Now, here is another piece from Reuters, I think, exclusive. US peace plan for Ukraine drew from a Russian document, sources say. So, like I said last night in my early morning video on Steve Witkoff, you got these two theses, and neither of them are good news. Like, either the Russians developed the plan themselves and handed it to Witkoff, or Witkoff and Kushner developed it and then brought Dmitriev on board and they co-developed it. So Reuters says the US peace plan for Ukraine was partly based on a Russian document outlining Moscow's demands, including territorial concessions Ukraine had already rejected. And then after a global backlash, 9 of those 28 points were removed in talks with Kyiv and European partners, and they came up with a 19, 20-point peace plan. Okay. Now, apparently, we hear today, this is from CNN, that Ukraine supports most of the revised US peace plan, but firmly rejects 3 key demands. And this is interesting because yesterday we talked about the army being at 800,000. Actually, it looks like the size of the armed forces is one of the key rejections, although that might be post-ceasefire, might be something different, and then pre-ceasefire, or they might be. Obviously, they're not going to reduce the size of their armed forces before they have a ceasefire, right? But reducing the size of its armed forces, abandoning NATO membership, and making any territorial concessions. And of course, those are massively key points that the Russians would want. So again, we get back to where we were months and months ago, where he's saying, look, they both got red lines that neither side are going to agree on. They're like, well, we just can't have peace if you are going to expect us to concede our territory, forego NATO membership, and reduce the size of our army. And then Russia are like, those are the very 3 things you absolutely have to do if we're going to have peace. Well, you're not going to have peace then. And so it goes on. And Russia know that, because Russia don't want peace. Ukraine aren't doing it to be obstinate. They're doing it because then they forego their sovereignty, and their existence going forward is threatened. And their present existence is diminished by point of fact that you're giving away a whole bunch of territories that this country's come in and stolen. So you completely understand Ukraine's position. Russia's position is just imperial. Now, the New York Times reports that some Trump administration officials believe that revisions to the peace framework that emerged from meetings between the US and Ukrainian negotiators in Geneva could lead Putin to dismiss it out of hand. So this new version of the peace plan, and this is what we've said, most of us have agreed that the likelihood is that Putin will just reject this out of hand. And that's apparently what many analysts are thinking, many negotiators, those associated with the negotiations, are thinking. So-called peace negotiations, says Tendar, between Ukraine and Russia will fail. It's inevitable. Putin's objective, the destruction of Ukraine and the USA, will never stop for as long as he draws breath. He crossed that point of no return a long time ago. This is in reaction to an article, US trumpets Ukraine talks progress, but sources reveal significant obstacles. So you remember that Caroline Leavitt yesterday, the White House press secretary, she came out and said, we've made great progress, but there are still not insurmountable obstacles type thing. But I think that is French for there are still some really big issues. You don't say, oh, there are some obstacles, but they're not insurmountable. That kind of phraseology suggests that actually they are really big. That it's not impossible that we get over them, but they are really significant. So I think even what Caroline Leavitt said yesterday indicates that there is an awful long way to go here to get agreement from Ukraine, let alone from Russia, right? Tendar says the negotiations only exist to delay and eventually to fall apart while trying to pin blame on Ukraine when President Zelensky rejects the destruction of his own homeland. Witkoff is just a vehicle to deliver that outcome. That's exactly what we said 6 months ago, 10 months ago, that Trump was coming in and saying, right, you need to do this, this, and this. And then Ukraine say, no, we can't do that. That's ridiculous. And then Trump goes, well, in that case, you don't want peace, and then uses that as a stick to hit Ukraine with. That's exactly what Tendar is saying here. So, we haven't moved at all in 10 months. Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, is lending a hand to Trump, it says War Translated here, issuing a press statement accusing the UK of attempting to undermine Trump's peacekeeping efforts. London is allegedly keen to see the war continue as it supposedly props up the British economy through defense contracts. Very clever from Russia here, trying to drive a dividing wedge between the UK and the US here. The press bureau of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation reports that according to information received by the SVR, many sober-minded Europeans are asking why the UK, despite the dire situation of the Ukrainian armed forces on the front lines, is continuing military operations and convincing its partners of the possibility of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. The answer is simple. War revenues are effectively saving the British economy from bankruptcy. The kingdom's once troubled defence industry has become the driving force of national industry. BAE Systems and Thales UK are implementing multi-billion-dollar contracts to manufacture military equipment for Kiev. UAV supplies to Ukraine are expected to increase, financed by EU countries. The expected revenue is over 6 billion. Blah, 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 blah. Saying that, London fears that Trump's peace deals could undermine this. So it's saying that the British are just supporting Ukraine because they want to make money out of this and are grifting off the whole war effort, and they are trying to undermine any peace negotiations. Of course, this puts the British, the Anglo-Saxons, at the heart of, at the top of the Kremlin's hit list. We found out from another media source, as they did an analysis, that the UK was seen as the biggest enemy to Russia now, and the United States way down there. And this kind of shows more of that, doesn't it? Where we are the bogeyman for the Russians. France and the UK will lead a working group on security guarantees for Ukraine, and the US will join that apparently for the first time. So a working group for security guarantees, that's exactly what's needed. Macron announced the initiative after a coalition of the willing meeting. Turkey joins for its Black Sea role. So good news there. But yeah, that's where we are going to, I guess, leave it at the moment. I'm just going to see if there's anything further out in the news spaces. Here's one more. European countries are working on an emergency plan B to stop Ukraine running out of money early next year in case they cannot reach a deal on raiding Russia's frozen assets to fund Kiev's war effort. So, you know, there is a lot riding on a number of different things. Not only is there the whole peace situation, but if Ukraine doesn't get the full frozen Russian assets amount, then you know things are looking very, very dodgy. So, you know, Ukraine need a lot of ducks to be in a very neat row here right now for them to have a realistic chance of prevailing here. And on the other side of the coin, Russia needs, you know, we often talk about Russia has time on its hands. I don't think it does anymore. I think Russia is wanting there to be a fairly hasty resolution to this, fully in their favor, and they're hoping that the US are going to deliver something that's fully in Russia's favor. And if they don't, then they'll punish Ukraine rather than Russia, and then that gets them out the bind they're in. We're hearing today that there's I think a mainstream media, maybe a CNN article, talking about how Russia are desperately trying to recruit foreign soldiers, for example, something I've been talking about for ages, and that is again another indication that they are struggling, you know, economically and in terms of personnel. So, you know, it's this game of attritional chicken where, you know, you've got these pressure cookers that are bubbling away. Which lid will blow first, depending on economic, material, and human resource pressures. And each country, Ukraine and Russia, has different weightings to those different elements, and it is a febrile time, and both sides have maybe a different analysis of how time will work in their favor or not. And it might be time works in our favor for this aspect. So for Ukraine, you know, for personnel, time is not working in their favor, but for weapons development and new weapons coming online, then, you know, they're in a better position. So on the one hand, you know, we don't have much time for you know, on the front lines, if we're going to be entirely relying on personnel to stop the Russian advances, but then we have all these weapons coming online that could be really cool for striking. So, you know, everyone's got all these different variables being thrown around, but the end result is that Russia will want the US to do its bidding to give it the best chance of prevailing in the war, and the US is in chaos because half of the White House, or probably most of the White House, wants to do Russia's bidding, but most of the establishment politicians and military personnel don't want to do Russia's bidding. And we're seeing that kind of chaos seep through the American political landscape. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.